Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Today I'd like to learn more about the challenges in the country's courts, including the Supreme Court, that will determine the outcomes of elections and voting rights of many Americans. There's no one better able to explain all of this than my friend Jerry Goldfeder, who's one of the country's leading legal experts on election law and my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to see you again.
It's great always to talk to you. So we call you a legal expert on election law, but you represent clients.
Yes, I do.
From all ranges of offices.
Candidates for local office all the way up to President of the United States.
And then you teach?
I teach at Fordham Law School and University of Pennsylvania Law School. I teach election law.
And then you write a lot.
I do.
Do you have a regular column in the Law Journal?
I do. I have a bi-monthly column that I co-author with a colleague from the Brennan Center, and I also write articles on my own as well.
And then you have this big book, the Goldfeder something. What is that?
Goldfeder's Modern Election Law.
Yeah, what is that?
It's a treatise on election law, and actually, as we speak, I'm revising the latest edition will be out.
The fifth edition?
The fifth edition will be out in the...
Well, that's pretty prodigious. And what else do you do in your spare time?
I go to the movies. And why are all the movies closing down, Ronnie?
Oh, all the movie houses, right?
The movie houses.
It's such
One
a
on
shame.
63rd Street, the landmark downtown. When we were younger, there were so many movie theaters on the west side of Manhattan.
Absolutely.
And now there are so few.
I go up before you, I think. There was 81st Street, 83rd Street, the New Yorker, which was Yorktown, the beginning, the Stoddard, which was at 90th Street. Then you went up to 96th Street, there were two. And then the Midtown, whatever that one is, at 100th Street or something. And now they're what?
You think we would have more movies if we had commercial rent protection?
We might.
Yeah.
And if we didn't go so far with all this electronic stuff that we have, all the streaming and the this and the
Well, I
that.
think people still go to the movies.
Yeah, it's a great social thing.
They're always crowded. It is a great social thing.
Well, that's not what we're here to talk about.
No, we're not here to talk about the election law of movies. No, we're not here to talk
There
about
were
that.
restrictions when you were kids. You had to go in with an adult. Or you did. An adult had to pay your ticket. I remember once asking somebody to. And then there was a matron.
There was a
for the
matron
children.
who would quiet the kids all the time,
Yeah, it was-
which of course made no sense because there was no way that anyone was going to quiet us. That was one of the reasons we went to the movies, so we could carry on with our friends.
Right.
So let's talk about
Yeah.
the elections.
Right. What's happening in the world? They're
Well,
both
we've had some-
restrictive and generous, right?
Well, since let's just go back a few years, since 2010, when the Republicans took over so many state legislatures and governor's offices, the Republicans have had a lot of control over our laws because, number one, they were in control of the state legislatures during redistricting. You know, we do that every 10 years. Every 10 years we have a census and we draw new lines for the state legislatures, for the Congress, and so on. And they did that. And they drew lines that benefited them dramatically so. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, we have had more people voting for Democrats, but we've had more congressional Republicans. So
That
the
was
laws
just
in
a court
Republican
case.
was just struck down as being too partisan, which is a new creative theory that lawyers and activists have come up with in order to strike down these lines, these lines that are so unfair to voters. And the Supreme Court of the United States just heard an argument a few months ago, and they're going to rule probably in June as to whether or not districting lines can be stricken down as unconstitutional because they're too partisan. And what I mean by that is, look, when legislatures draw lines, they take into account a variety of things, not the least of which is incumbency protection, partisan influence, and so on, partisan interests. And that's okay. That's generally been acceptable, except if you go too far, the argument is. So the Supreme Court of the United States is going to decide whether or not we can strike down lines that are too partisan, which really deny the voters an opportunity to have representatives that really reflect them. So we've seen that in a few lower courts have done it, and Pennsylvania just did it. And we're going to hear from the Supreme Court of the United States on that.
What do you think is going to happen?
I really don't know, and the reason I don't know is because how do you judge? This is the issue before the Supreme Court. How do you judge whether something is too partisan? Well, we may have different views as to that. And generally speaking, the argument is if Democrats vote, to use an example, which is, it's not a hypothetical, if Democrats vote for congresspeople throughout a state, 55 to 45, but they get only 45% of the seats, then is that too partisan? Is it, if it's 52-48 and the other side gets 52% of the seats and so on, is that not partisan enough? So what standard do you use? The challenge for the Supreme Court of the United States, as they've articulated it, is how do we make that decision? What standard do we apply? Now, you and I may look at a map and look at the results of an election and say, obviously, too partisan. But for courts to do that, if they're going to be fair and objective, and we hope they are, they need some kind of a standard to strike down those laws as too partisan. So it'll be very interesting to see what the Supreme Court does.
Could be devastating. Pretty bad, or you don't think so?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going to be a liberal-conservative
that's
vote on the Supreme Court. Well, time will tell.
But it also affects, doesn't it, race?
When you draw lines, you take race into
Right.
consideration. You
I
take.
guess it's based on assumption that people of color are more likely to be Democrats?
Well, it's not an assumption.
It's true.
It's true. It's empirically true. And so that's taken into consideration. You're allowed to use demographics. You're allowed to use economic strata. You're allowed to use partisanship. You're allowed to use race, except you can't use any one of them too much. It has to be relatively, objectively fair, except what does that mean? It may mean something different for us than for our political adversaries. So the courts are trying, I think, fairly to grapple with this. But the most important thing is that lawyers and activists are demanding that the courts strike down these laws that have had such a negative impact on people of color and on Democrats.
So gerrymandering is a major issue, right?
Yeah.
Then another thing is who can vote?
Who can vote? Voter ID laws. And going back to what I was saying a second ago about in 2010 when the Republicans took over, all these state legislatures, they have increasingly put into place restrictive voting laws. So you need an ID, you need a photo ID, and if you move from one state to another, you have a hard time getting a birth certificate in order to demonstrate who you are and when you were born in order to get a photo ID. So little by little, we have been challenging those, and we have been increasingly successful in striking down a lot of these harsh voter ID laws. In New York, we don't have that. In New York, you go to the polling place, you sign your name, the people behind the table, they look at your signature, they compare it with your previous signature, they say, you're okay, and they allow you to vote. We don't have to produce photo ID or anything. There are certain circumstances. The first time you're voting, if you do it through mail, you have to show an ID, but very few people. So actually, we have relatively okay laws in New York.
Yeah, but that's one of the rarities.
It is a rarity. We don't have early voting. We don't have same-day registration. We don't have no excuse absentee voting. You have to come up with some reason in order to mail in your ballot, and it can't. And one of the reasons is, well, I'm sick. Well, how do you know in advance you're going to be sick? And so you can't go to the polls. So we have very restrictive votes. And the governor, to his credit, has been in favor of expanding the rights of voters in New York. And the Democratic Assembly has been on record time and time again for that. And the Republicans, for some reason, are pretty recalcitrant about this. So we have not had these electoral reforms in New York. But I have a solution.
All right.
My solution is there's a law in New York State. It's called the Municipal Home Rule Law. Not many people know about it. Why should they? And it allows each city, there are 62 cities in New York, each city to have a city charter. We have a city charter in New York. And it allows us, even though we don't have initiative and referendum in New York, it does allow citizens, voters in the city to amend their charter. And we've amended our charter in order to have campaign finance reform. Because the state legislature didn't do it, we took it upon ourselves to have that reform by amending our charter. We've lowered the number of signatures to get on the ballot by amending our charter. So our proposal is, when I say our, some elected officials and activists and people like me are going to start circulating a petition to amend the charter of the city of New York to have same-day registration, early voting, no excuse absentee balloting, and instant runoff, so we don't have this extra runoff election for mayor or public.
Does instant runoff complicate the rest of it?
It does, but we can live with that.
We've had some of these citywide, what, you don't call them a referendum? Or they are citywide
We've
referendum?
had very few.
Yeah.
We've had very few. Usually they're kicked off the ballot. They're
Right.
usually declared unlawful.
Right.
But we had it for term limits.
Right.
And when charter commissions have put these reforms on the ballot, people have voted on them. So
How did they reverse them? I don't mean to digress,
that's all right.
but how did we reverse them to take the 2 terms and make them 3 terms without the charter change?
Because there are certain quirks in the law that allow the city council to
do it.
pass legislation without going to the people.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
All right, disenfranchise. There's a move, right, to increase the electorate by allowing people who are not allowed to vote to vote. Is
Right.
that restricted to people who've been convicted of crimes?
Well, convicted of felonies.
Yeah.
There are some states, and like in every area of our elections in this country, it's state controlled. There are
Why?
some, because the Constitution of the United States says that the states shall regulate their own elections, even for the national legislature, for the
It explicitly
Congress.
says that.
It explicitly
So it
says
would
that.
have to be an amendment.
No, Congress can override that. Congress can pass laws, and we've done that from time to time, rarely, like the Voting Rights Act, for example,
Right, yeah.
or motor voter,
Right.
that kind of thing. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, the states control their own elections. And various states throughout the last 100 years have prohibited felons from voting. Some states, once you're a felon, you could never vote again. Some states, you go through a process and you can regain your citizenship and so on. Originally, the literature shows us that originally it was enacted as a way of preventing African Americans from voting because of the higher, unfortunately, because of the higher rate of African Americans being incarcerated and so on. So there's been a move over the last several years to mitigate that, to try to eliminate these laws that say once you're a felon, you're out of luck forever, and to change them. Terry McAuliffe, who was the governor of Virginia, he signed an executive order that said there were thousands and thousands of former felons that they could now vote. So, of course, the Republicans took him to court and said you couldn't do it that way. You had to sign each and every one. So he went back to his desk and he signed thousands and thousands and thousands of orders permitting all these people who had been felons the ability to vote. I wish we had that kind of aggressive, reformed behavior, conduct here in New York.
Yeah, but does the next governor have to do the same thing? Or was that a permanent change?
No, it's what he did for those individuals.
And that was for life, for the rest of their life?
For those people, yes.
Right. And then we have college students and that whole argument. And a lot of that is based then on what happens in the, I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking about it now. In New York, for instance, when we try to close a prison, it's too important economically for the city that it's in to close it. So do the Republicans feel that letting people in college use their college address instead of their home address? I mean, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so if you have an area, particularly upstate New York, which are areas that are more or less controlled by Republicans, the fact that there are prisons there means that there's a whole group of people based upon the economics of that
So they're
who
counted,
will vote for them.
and they're counted in the census.
No, we're not talking about the prisoners. We're talking about the people who work
Oh, I see.
in the criminal justice system. So if the prison closes, those people
Don't have a
move
job.
away.
Yeah.
They don't have a job, they move away.
Right.
And so the influence of the college students increases. And so some Republicans have argued that college students shouldn't be able to use their college address in order to vote in those places. They should be voting where their parents live and where they grew up and whatnot. The Constitution allows people who are 18 years old to vote. And our laws say if you're living somewhere, you're allowed to claim that residence as your voting address. And so the Republicans attempt to disenfranchise students by saying you can't use your college address. I think that will fail. But they're doing it across the country. It's not just here in New York.
Right.
And so that's just another battle. That's just another obstacle that Republicans are throwing up in order to decrease the influence of Democratic-leaning demographic groups in order for them to gain more power. And so we have to fight voting restrictions, we have to fight redistricting, we have to fight the loss of college students being able to vote. It's a constant battle, but nobody has ever said it was easy. All you need to do is listen to John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who has been through
From the beginning.
from the beginning in the last 50 some odd years has fought for voting rights. He's been arrested almost 50 times because of his struggles for voting rights. So it's a challenge, but there's no substitute for taking on that challenge and fighting in the streets, fighting at the ballot box, fighting in the courts.
It's so interesting. I mean, I was fascinated that New Hampshire is one of the most restrictive states in the country, is it?
Actually, New Hampshire has a pretty quirky law that allows, in a presidential race, you can be a Republican, and then that day in the primary, you can vote in the Democratic primary for President of the United States, or vice versa. So I'm only aware of the New Hampshire
good
liberal
things.
vote.
Okay. Why don't we have more national standards?
Because when this great republic was born,
Yeah.
in order to
get
get the
the states.
Constitution signed on by enough states and ratified by enough states, the most critical compromise included, we're going to give the states control over their elections. We're going to give the states control over who gets elected president of the United States. We're going to keep control of the politics of our country with the states. And we have been living with that for the last 230 years.
That's why we have the Electoral College.
That is exactly why we have the Electoral College. There's a variety of reasons. Part of it has to do with racism, part of it has to do with not trusting voters, but part of it has to do with each state shall decide who their electors are, and those electors from those states will control who the President of the United States are. That's why we get something like in 2016 and the year 2000, where the Electoral College vote carried more weight, carried the critical weight, rather than the popular vote.
So when women, I mean, you're on the board at the Museum of the City of New York. They had a great exhibit on suffrage.
It's a wonderful exhibit. It's called Beyond Suffrage. It's about the struggle for suffrage and as well as other rights for women.
But women could vote in New York, but not necessarily in another state.
That's right, because we passed the constitutional amendment a few years before the United States Constitution was amended.
Right.
So the United States Constitution was amended in 1917. I believe we did it in 1913.
It was 100 years, yeah.
Yeah.
So why, I can't understand why we can't somehow move to that. I mean, there's always a movement to eliminate the Electoral College. Would that carry with it other things to more nationalize voting?
If we
Do you
had
think that's ever going to happen? It's certainly not now.
in order to amend the Constitution,
Yeah.
we need 3/4 of the states. Very, very difficult.
And the Congress can never do it.
The Congress can't do it. But there is something called the National Popular Vote, which if enough states pass it, we can circumvent the Electoral College. Each state would, instead of giving its votes to the winner in that state, would give its votes, its Electoral College votes, to the winner nationally. So if we had enough states that added up to 270 Electoral College votes, and each state said, we're not going to pay attention to what happens in our state, we're going to focus in on who wins nationally. And if there are enough states that have 270 Electoral College votes to do that, they would be required to cast a ballot, cast their Electoral College votes for the winner nationally. And you don't have to amend the Constitution of the United States to do that. We've had 11 states and Washington, D.C. have passed that law and New York is one of them, saying we're not going to give our Electoral College votes to the winner in New York, we're going to give it nationally. But we only have states that add up to 165 Electoral College votes. We need states that add up to 270, because then if they did that, it would mean that the national popular vote would matter.
That Donald Trump wouldn't be president.
That's right. You know, after the year 2000, when we had Bush v. Gore and Bush won the Electoral College vote and Gore won the popular vote, Hillary Clinton was elected to the United States Senate that very year, and she put in the hopper in Congress a bill to abolish the Electoral College. And there was a big movement at that time, and it went nowhere.
Electoral College are there fractional votes, proportional votes?
No.
A state can't divide it up.
Well, it can choose to do so.
Oh, it can.
It can choose to do so.
Yeah.
48 states and Washington, D.C. are winner take all. If you win the vote, if Hillary wins by one vote or Trump wins by one vote, they get all the Electoral College votes of that state. Maine and Nebraska divided up. You have to, if you win in a congressional district, you win a vote from that congressional district, and then you win extra votes if you win statewide. Every state can decide differently. They can all decide, well, we're going to give it out proportionally, because like everything else, it's up to the states how they elect the president, how they give their Electoral College votes. That was the grand bargain in 1789, and the problem we're still living with. The states can decide.
And so that all comes back to gerrymandering and redistricting.
That's right. That's right.
It's so fascinating to me. Now, the census, does a census count college students at home or at the college site?
It depends on where they claim their residency is. Yeah.
So we get different kinds, they're unequal, different measurements.
Well, it depends on residence, where people claim to be living.
In New York State, how would you change it? Well, it would be simple if you just had these Democrats who vote Republican, right? Vote Democrat in our state Senate.
Well, they don't necessarily vote Republican, but they're allied with the Republicans.
Right.
So if
I meant allied.
Yeah, if every senator who was elected as a Democrat caucused with the Democrats would be in control of the state Senate, and we'd have a whole different landscape in Albany.
We would have a whole different, right, the landscape would then produce all different results. We could make our elections much better.
That's right. So absolutely right. And we would have a governor who would sign all those reforms into law, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It is always so fascinating to me. Here is New York State considered a Democratic state with a split legislature, and therefore not all the different things we'd like. So do you have an optimistic outlook that we're going to straighten out voting?
We have to have an optimistic outlook. We have to keep at it.
We share
Absolutely.
that, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
We've been at this for many years.
Many years.
And I mean, I don't know. It's another program that we can talk about how you came to be interested, or maybe we did before, but it's dismaying not to see more citizen action and citizen participation in a lot of things.
It is, and you know, the marches, the Women's March, all the groups that have popped up after 2016, it's great. It's energizing. It
Right.
makes you optimistic.
Right.
But all of those people, marching is not enough. Going on Facebook and putting in your comments, that's not enough. Taking photos and sharing your Instagram experiences, it's not enough. You have to join a political club, or you have to fight as a lawyer. You have to register to vote. You have to do all these things, and you have to run for office. Time magazine just recently on its cover had all these women running for office. Of course we should be optimistic.
Right. Well, that's a good point.
That's a great outcome of 2016.
Good.
We have all these people who are now energized.
That's true. It's a great ending. Thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
We at CUNY TV always like to hear from our viewers. So if you have any subjects you'd like to explore or people you'd like to hear, please let us know. Write to us at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or go to our website, cuny.tv, and click on Contact Us. We look forward to hearing from you.